Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. That's where we'll be. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I like 2 Corinthians chapter 11. It's an exciting chapter. Chapter 12 is exciting to me as well. And I do find chapter 11 a little difficult to outline, maybe a little difficult to preach. And so if you'll bear with me, which by the way is a phrase that Paul uses in this chapter, if you'll bear with me, I'll appreciate it. In chapter 11, what Paul is doing as he writes to these Corinthians, and I want us to, I like when we study a letter that is so listener-focused or recipient-focused, like Corinthians, both letters are. I like us to keep in mind what the Corinthian Christians would think as they receive these words. And I try to bring that up as we go, and I want us to do that tonight. But as Paul writes this chapter, what Paul is doing is he is defending himself throughout the book of 2 Corinthians. And specifically, here he begins to defend his authority and to defend his apostleship. In chapter 1, they had already accused Paul, or there was this accusation floating around that Paul simply couldn't be trusted. And we studied that. They said that he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. He said he's going to come and visit us, and he didn't come. He changed his plans. They said, at least Paul responded to this accusation of Paul's yes is not yes, his no is not no. You cannot trust the words of Paul. And we saw as he addressed that accusation. In chapter 10 last week, we studied, as they said, apparently, he's bold when he writes letters, but when he shows up in person, he's really quite timid. He's nothing to be afraid of. Don't worry about Paul. He talks a big game in these letters that we read before the congregation, but when he shows up, he's really not much to be impressed by. Maybe in chapter 11, then we come to chapter 11, and they seem to be saying it's not just that Paul can't be trusted, and it's not just that Paul's a terrible preacher and really not that significant when he arrives, but in chapter 11, it seems that they're saying he's not even a true apostle. And maybe there are men there in the church, and they're teaching the congregation, there was this group of men that traveled with Jesus. And they saw the miracles that he did. And they were commissioned by him personally to go out into the world and to take this message of the gospel into the world. And maybe they're saying to the congregation there, they saw him ascend into heaven. There were 12 of them. Judas betrayed him. They replaced Judas with a man named Matthias. Those were the men who were in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. They were the ones that heard that mighty rushing wind and saw the tongues of fire and received that full manifestation of the Holy Spirit. Those were the men that stood up on the day of Pentecost and preached that gospel sermon, that first gospel sermon. Those are the true apostles, and Paul isn't one of them. Paul wasn't there for any of that. Paul is not an apostle. Maybe that's what's happening in the Corinthian church. And we're likely dealing with, as we get into the text in just a moment, we're likely dealing with what we call often Judaizing Christians. And these are men who have come into the church, teachers who've come into the congregation. They're members of the church. They've been baptized into Christ, but like many members of the church in the first century, they have a Jewish background. They grew up Jewish. Maybe they've been converted to Christianity, but not all the way converted. They still hold on tight to some Jewish practices and some Jewish customs. And now they're even binding those customs on the Christians here. Maybe they're telling the Christians in Corinth that certain elements of the Jewish religion are still required. Now imagine if you are a new Christian in Corinth, and really all the Christians in Corinth would have been new. Maybe you have a Gentile, maybe you have a pagan background. Maybe you grew up your entire life believing in and worshiping various idols that were in your house, or going to temples to practice worship services to various false gods. And you finally heard of the true and the living God. And you finally heard about this Christ who sacrificed, who gave his life, died on a cross so you could have your sins washed away. Maybe it was Paul himself who taught you those things. You first heard it from Paul. You believed it. You obeyed. You've been faithful to church. And now these false teachers come in and they say, well, that's not all you need to know. Paul didn't tell you the whole story. Paul didn't tell you everything. In fact, Paul can't even be trusted. Paul has let you down by only giving you a piece of the story. Maybe they teach that the men need to be circumcised, or again, they provide some list of Jewish customs to the congregation, and they say, these things have to take place if you want your soul to be saved. And maybe through all of that, they're not humble in their approach, but they use that opportunity to puff themselves up and to boast about themselves and to brag about how wonderful and how strong their faith is. Maybe they stand up and say, look, I know you've obeyed the gospel, but you're still a Gentile. I'm a Jew. I can trace my lineage back to Abraham, and you just barely came to know God. Maybe they use that to what they think is their own benefit. And so Paul writes this portion of Scripture, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, not only to defend himself, but to discredit those accusers and really to save the souls of those Corinthian Christians. And in this text, Paul gets very specific when it comes to the teachings, the false teachings that are taking place there. He gets very specific about their accusations, but it's really not how he approaches the problem. And this is where I get a little mixed up. I hope I can explain what I try to explain here well. It's not how he approaches the problem as he writes to the Corinthian church. Instead, what he does is he compares himself with these accusers. He doesn't just immediately list all the things they said wrong and tell us why they're wrong. They've accused Paul. They've dragged him into this argument. And so Paul compares himself throughout this chapter with these accusers. And in doing so, he describes himself or in describing himself, he amplifies how unfit these accusers really are. The first thing Paul does is tells these Corinthian Christians, I'm jealous for you. I am jealous for you. Look at verse 1 of chapter 11. He says, I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you are bearing with me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I may present you as a pure virgin. What I want us to focus on is that Paul says that he is jealous for them with a godly or with a divine jealousy. Paul is jealous for these Christians like God is jealous for our souls. In Exodus chapter 20, God gives those 10 commandments to the people, and he says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And what God is saying there is that I don't want you to serve anyone else. I don't want you to leave me. I don't want anything between you and me. And Paul is saying that I am jealous for you Corinthian Christians, just like God is jealous for his people. In verse 3 of chapter 11, he describes what he's leading up to, exactly what he's worried about. You know, when you're jealous, you think of a boyfriend and a girlfriend in high school, and maybe I see my girlfriend over there having a conversation with someone else, and I become jealous, and I say, I'm jealous, and here's why I'm jealous, because I'm afraid of what's going to happen next. Paul does the same thing. In verse 3, he says, but I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. He says, just like Eve was deceived by that serpent, just like Eve in that garden who interacted with that serpent and was deceived by the words that came from his mouth, I'm afraid that your minds and that your thoughts will be led astray. You remember, in the garden they were told, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. And the serpent comes along and says, you will surely not die. And Eve so quickly, so easily was deceived, and she was drawn away. Paul says, I'm afraid that's going to happen when you hear these false teachers. In verse 4, he says, here's why I'm afraid it's going to happen. I have evidence that this could be the case. Here is what has provoked my jealousy. He says, for if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. He says, if someone comes and teaches you something other than what I taught you, you receive them. You welcome them in. You receive them beautifully. You indulge them. You put up with that false teaching. New King James Version says you may well put up with it, with another Jesus or with another spirit or with another gospel altogether. Paul says, I am jealous for you. I'm worried that you're going to be drawn away back into the teachings of these false teachers. I'm worried because when they come and they preach to you, even if it's something completely different than what I delivered to you, you entertain it. Paul says, I preach to you what was the purity of the gospel. And what I want to do is present you to Christ in that pure state of Christianity. But you're going to be corrupted by these false teachers who come in to your midst and who you entertain. And here's where the comparison. I think what Paul is saying inadvertently is they're not jealous for you. They're not afraid for your souls. They don't really care about you, but I do. Paul says, I'm jealous for you to those Corinthian Christians. Next, he says, I served you. Again, think about the comparison that he's making with these false teachers who have come in. In verse 7, he says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge. Paul says, did I sin? And he's a little facetious here, the way he presents this. Maybe I sinned when I came into you humbly. Maybe it was a mistake for me to come into you the way that I did. When I came to you and taught you, I humbled myself. And I did that so that you might be exalted. I didn't charge you a thing. And you seem to think that that's a bad thing. The fact that I came into you humbly, that I didn't charge you for my services, that I didn't ask you to support me in any way, you seem to think that that is a negative. And we've seen that before. If we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think it's in verse 12, Paul makes it clear that he had every right to demand that they support him financially, but he did not because he did not want to hinder the gospel of Christ. Whatever that means, Paul thought if he demanded the Corinthians financially support him, he would get in the way of the gospel. And the Corinthian Christians seem to think, you get what you pay for. Or at least the false teachers that have come in have said that you get what you pay for. How much did Paul charge you? How much did you support him financially? Maybe they say, well, he didn't charge us a thing. Well, you get what you pay for. And that's kind of a true rule many times, but not in the case, of course, of the Apostle Paul. Maybe now they think, well, the other guy's better because he charges a lot. Look at verse 8. He says, I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need, and in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you, and I will continue to do so. Again, he says, I never charged you a penny. I didn't want to hinder the gospel. I didn't want to be a burden to you. Instead, I chose to let other churches support me financially. I received money from other congregations so that I would be able to share the gospel in Corinth. And maybe, Paul is saying facetiously, maybe that was all a big mistake. I gave you the gospel and I took nothing from you in return. Maybe he's also comparing himself now with those false teachers. Remember what I've done in order to preach the gospel that I shared with you first. Think about what I've done. Think about maybe Paul saying, think about the lifestyle that I lived. Think about how I humbled myself. Think about all of the needs I had while I was there. Maybe they haven't considered it. And Paul is saying, think about the fact that I humbled myself in order to lift you up, in order to exalt you. What have these false teachers done? How much have they charged you? How often are they talking about their financial needs with you? Paul says, I'm jealous for you with a divine jealousy, and I served you in the most humble way that I could to lift you up, and I'm going to continue to do so. Third, he tells them, I love you. In verse 11, he says, why? Why did I do that? Why did I not charge you? Why was I willing to do that? Again, being facetious, because I do not love you? He says, God knows that I do. I think maybe he's again addressing an accusation, regardless of what these false teachers are saying. Paul's saying they aren't jealous for you like I am. They didn't humble themselves before you in order to exalt you like I was willing to do. And even if these false teachers come in and they say, Paul doesn't really care about you, Paul reminds the Corinthian Christians, it's not that I care about you. God knows that I love you. Far more than just caring about you, Paul loves these Christians. He continues forth and he tells them, not only am I jealous for you, sorry, I lost my track. Not only am I jealous for you, not only did I humble myself to serve you, not only do I love you, but he says, I was sent by Christ himself. I am a true apostle. The word apostle, if you go back into the Greek, means one sent with a message. And Paul is an apostle of Christ. An apostle of Christ is one sent with a message from Christ. And this is where Paul really hammers home the idea that he is in fact an apostle, and in doing so he clearly exposes these false teachers who are doing nothing more than lifting themselves up and harming that church. In verse 12 he says, "But what am I doing, or what I am doing I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity, to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting." Paul starts and he says, I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing. I'm going to continue to preach the gospel. And when needed, I'm going to continue to defend myself. I'm going to continue to be jealous for you Christians in Corinth. I'm going to continue to serve you humbly. I'm going to continue to exalt you, to lift you up. I'm going to continue to care about you and even love you. I'm going to continue to do all of the things that I've done. Why, Paul? Why are you going to carry on? Why aren't you going to stop doing what you're doing? Paul says, so that these false teachers will lose their opportunity. So I can put these false teachers out of business. They claim to have the same authority that Paul and the other apostles had. In verse 13, he says, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ." And again, an apostle is one sent with a message, and an apostle of Christ is one sent with a message by Christ. And these men, who the Corinthian Christians seem to be enamored by, the men that the Corinthian Christians are willing to entertain and listen to these fancy words that they say, these men who accuse Paul of not being honest and not being trustworthy and being timid when you see him, are liars. Paul says they're false apostles. They claim to be sent by Christ, but they have not been sent by Christ. But I have been. I'm a true apostle. And as the chapter began, Paul began defending his decisions. And as the chapter began, he began defending his authority. And he defended not only those things, he defended his sincere love for these Corinthian Christians. In the very first verse, if we look at it again, he says, "I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness. But indeed, you are bearing with me." And what Paul is saying is, bear with me and allow me to boast just a little. Bear with me and allow me to brag just a little. And as he defends himself and as he exposes these false teachers, what he says is, allow me to lower myself just enough to brag about some things. Allow me to follow the example of these guys that come in and puff themselves up, these guys that come in and brag about all of the things that they've done. Give me just a moment. Bear with me. Let me entertain this foolishness. Let me brag just a moment. And then he explains, I'm jealous for you like God is jealous for souls. I served you and I humbled myself when I was with you so that you could be exalted. This is how Paul brags. I loved you. I am a true apostle of Christ. And then if we go to verse 16, after Paul has said all of that, and after he has exposed the teachers and expressed the love for the Corinthians, look at verse 16. He says, "Again I say, Let no one think me foolish, but if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that I may boast a little. He's exposed those teachers and their practices. They like to boast, and so Paul's now engaging in that foolishness. He says here again, let me be foolish just a little bit longer. Don't think bad of me, we might say, if we were Paul today. But even if you do, allow me to brag just a little bit more. Look at verse 17. He says, what I am saying, I'm not saying as the Lord would, but as in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting. What I'm going to tell you, what I've already told you, isn't what the Lord would prefer I say. He's lowering himself just a little to make his point. In verse 18, he says, since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast also. Since they come in and they brag about all of their accomplishments and who they are and what they've done, I'm going to join in for just a moment. And again, you can see that Paul is being a bit facetious. In verse 19, he says, for you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly. For you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. You can see Paul is a little conniving here. He says in that first verse, verse 19, you guys are wise enough to tolerate foolishness. You think you're so smart. Well, let me brag for just a minute. Let me join in the things that you think are wonderful, this foolishness of those false teachers, the foolishness that they employ. He says, you put up with it when people enslave you. You put up with it when they come to you and they take advantage of you. You put up with it when anyone comes in and exalts themselves and puffs themselves up, nothing of which Paul has done. Paul goes on, you put up with it even when someone hits you in the face. In verse 21, he says, to my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. If you compare me with those false teachers who puff themselves up, who call me weak, who seem to be so bold and so willing to brag about themselves, I'll admit to you, by that standard, I've been weak. And again, Paul's being facetious. I could have bragged more about myself, is what Paul's saying. You're right. You love bragging so much. You like all of that talk. I should have done more. And you see that sarcasm. Verse 22 then, and we'll pick up in the middle of verse 21, but Paul gives this list of accomplishments. He lays out the resume of Paul, what he's been through as an apostle, what he has experienced as an apostle, some of what qualifies him to be that apostle. And again, think about the comparison between Paul and these false teachers. Paul and these Judaizing Christians who puff themselves up. The humble example, the sincere love that Paul has for this church, and then these men who have come in and tried to discredit Paul. Halfway through 21, he says, but in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak foolishness. That's in parentheses. He's saying, wink, wink, this is me talking like a fool. But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, and I speak foolishness, I am just as bold myself. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? Paul says, so am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so. In far more labors and far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all of the churches. Paul says, you like bragging so much, let me partake. Let me engage in that bragging. Just let me play the fool for just a minute. I don't want to talk like this, but it seems to be what you all love, so let me set the record straight. And then he lays out all of these things that he has experienced as a true apostle for Christ. How bad must it have been in the city of Corinth and in the congregation at Corinth for Paul to arrive at this point, to realize that this is the answer. This is how he's going to solve the problems. For Paul to speak about his qualifications in the way that he does. This isn't how Paul would prefer to communicate. He's got better things to talk about. He would much prefer to be sharing the gospel with someone who'd never heard it, or building up the Corinthians instead of admonishing them to remove these false teachers from that congregation. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 is a chapter where it seems that Paul is to the point that he says it's time to get this right. I need to go on the record and make this abundantly clear. It's time to expose who these false teachers are and what they're doing, to describe the danger that they are and just how false they are. Clearly describe all that Paul has endured as an apostle. Paul is jealous as God is jealous. Paul is a servant to those Corinthian Christians. Paul loved the Christians at Corinth, and he was a true apostle sent by Christ. And as I look at this chapter, what impresses me the most, I guess, on a grand scale, on a bird's eye view, I should say, is the sincerity of Paul. He wants nothing more than those Corinthian Christians to remain pure. He means it when he says he's jealous. He wants to present them to Christ. He's the one that delivered them to Christ in the first place, and he wants nothing more than for their souls to remain pure. And as I think about that, I ask myself, am I as sincerely concerned with the souls around me as Paul was in this chapter of 2 Corinthians? Am I as willing to humble myself in order to exalt others as Paul was willing to humble himself? Would I endure the sufferings that Paul endured and continue to remain faithful to God? Those are three very big questions in my mind. And I honestly won't say that I know the answer to all three of those questions. I haven't experienced those things. I know there's room for improvement, but I am thankful for the life and for the example. I'm thankful for the sufferings, and I'm thankful for the sincerity of Paul, writing these words down by the inspiration of God so that you and I can study them, apply them in our lives even tonight.